Hello there. Welcome to my review of the 1994 film The Shadow, starring Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston, The Shadow, Penelope Ann Miller as love interest Margot Lane, and John Lone as the villain Shiwan Khan. With a supporting cast of well-known character actors such as Tim Curry as the evil henchman Farley Claymore, Jonathan Winters as Lamont's Chief of Police Uncle Wainwright, Peter Boyle as Lamont's taxi driving chauffeur Mo Shrevnitz, and an early Hollywood role for Ian McKellen as Margot's father Reinhard Lane, plus a host of faces you should recognise filling out some of the smaller roles. The film is directed by Australian Russell Mulcahy, whose films include The Highlander and, sadly, Highlander 2, and was written by David Koepp, who was the writer on Jurassic Park just the year before. Created in 1930, The Shadow is arguably America's first superhero, possessing the powers of hypnotism and telepathy, and using those powers to make himself invisible to the evildoers he pursues. The character was a clear inspiration to the comic strip heroes that followed him. The Shadow began as a narrator on a publishing company's radio hour that was hoping to shift more of their pulp novels, but became so popular that he was fleshed out into his own books and radio series, followed by some movie serials, and much later in the 1970s in his own comic book, before returning to cinemas in 1994. Following the success of 1989's Batman, it seemed like every studio was trying to create its own franchise, and presumably because of Batman's Art Deco set design, they all looked to heroes of the distant past rather than what was popular in comics at the time. Universal decided to dip its toe into the genre with this character. So, on to the spoiler-free review. I really like this film, despite its flaws. It's not for everyone, and I can understand why people might not enjoy it as much as I do, but I am a fan. The third act is weak. There's no getting away from that. Khan's villainous scheme is not nearly as clever as it deserves to be, and is a throwback to simpler times that just doesn't work. It feels hollow. But personally, I think there's enough good in the rest of the film to let that slide. The cast are all excellent, with Alec Baldwin doing all the heavy lifting, and giving The Shadow all the charm and wit that a leading character needs. Penelope Ann Miller looks perfect as a 1930s it girl, and subverts the usual damsel in distress role by being an intellectual match for Baldwin's Cranston. John Lone has a whale of a time as Khan, playing the role as a villain who really does enjoy being a monster. All the supporting cast are pulling their weight, particularly Tim Curry as the ultimate slimeball henchman. The sets are gorgeous. If you're a fan of Art Deco, there's no better example of it than in this film. The matte paintings are pretty seamlessly integrated, and the spearing CGI looks mostly good, with the exception of the living dagger, the Purba, which never looks quite right. The score is by Jerry Goldsmith and perfectly fits the tone of the film. It's never overbearing and is a modern orchestral score with elements of 1930s style. The dialogue is snappy and has some very dry wit with some really memorable one-liners, and the direction is generally very good. It moves at a good pace so that no scene feels too long to keep the story moving, and, as I mentioned at the start of this review, the only thing that lets it down is the villain's scheme. So if you enjoy a fun, well-written Art Deco romp and forgive a slightly weaker finale, then I would suggest you seek this out. I'd rate it as nothing but the best. If you haven't seen the film, but are now interested based on this review, stop this video now, as I'm about to go into spoiler territory. In a bold move for a superhero action film, The Shadow opens in the opium fields of Tibet. A rival opium smuggler has been captured and is presented to Yin Ko at his fortress. The man attempts to escape by holding Yin Ko's trusted bookkeeper hostage, at which point Yin Ko tells his men to shoot through the bookkeeper. Yin Ko is our lead character, Lamont Cranston. And I imagine at this point the audience was pretty confused. It's similar to the opening of a much more successful film, Iron Man, 14 years later, except that perhaps the presentation of our hero as a ruthless drug lord is a more difficult redemption to buy than that of arms dealer Tony Stark. Realistically, there isn't much difference between the two. Both cause untold misery to people all around the world, but Iron Man presents the situation in a much lighter tone, which was obviously more palatable to the audiences in 2014. In another similarity on their path to redemption, both men are promptly kidnapped. Although Lamont is taken by a holy man, the Tulka, who wants to save his soul, and Tony Stark is taken by villains who want him to make more weapons. And while Tony uses his time to go on a journey of self-discovery, Lamont is very much led there. We then get an opening crawl that explains what happened to Lamont and how he now fights for justice as the Shadow, able to cloud men's minds to appear invisible, leaving only his shadow behind. Was this opening crawl a missed opportunity to show more of the origin story of the Shadow? How he got his powers? How he learns to use them? Would the movie have worked better if it had been more about his first time out as the Shadow? I'm not sure. I think the idea that he's established and we are as much in the dark about his powers as the rest of the characters in the film works very well. And it was much more common at the time to have little origin story as possible in these types of films. I certainly think that a story that really dealt with the full origins of the Shadow might be an interesting idea. And if the character ever does return to the screen, maybe that is something that will be pursued. But it's not something audiences at the time would have expected. And I don't think the film suffers without it. So the film then moves on to New York, where we meet Professor Roy Tam, who has fallen foul of some mobsters and is about to take a dive into the river wearing cement shoes, before the Shadow shows up and saves him. The Shadow explains that now he's been saved by him, he must become an agent of the Shadow, helping him whenever he's called upon. It's a nice little introduction to who Lamont has become, but the way it's written and shot means that it might have worked better if we, the audience, hadn't seen the opening crawl or the scenes with the Holy Man, and then we'd been shown that in flashback later on in the film. It would have left us not knowing whether he was still evil, and up until the point at which he saves Tam. And even then it would have been somewhat dubious, as he saves him for purely selfish reasons. Without seeing the Tulka and the crawl, it wouldn't have been clear that the Shadow was the hero for quite a while into the story, as he doesn't really do anything heroic for quite a while. This might have been too much, but based on the opening scenes of the film, it's something they could have played with, who the villain really was, right up until the point the hero and the villain meet, which would have been really interesting. As it is, it works fine, but that would have really been an original take on the genre. We are subsequently introduced to Margot Lane as the love interest, with her own psychic abilities that she is largely unaware of, and her father, who is working on an energy device for the War Office that surely couldn't be used as a weapon.
I guess you call it an implosive, explosive submolecular device.
Or an atomic bomb.
And also we meet the villain Shiwan Khan, last descendant of Genghis Khan, who ships himself to a museum in Genghis Khan's solid silver sarcophagus and then uses his own psychic abilities to make a security guard kill himself. It's a really interesting introduction to that villain that shows just how little regard he has for human life by making someone shoot themselves rather than using his abilities just to make the man forget what he'd seen. But it also serves to bring Khan to the attention of Lamont, who is informed of the mysterious event at the museum by another of his agents. This all leads to Lamont getting a visit from Khan in Lamont's sanctum, where Khan attempts to reignite Lamont's dark side and recruit him in his plot to rule the world. This is an interesting subversion of the villain and hero meeting face-to-face trope that in recent years has resulted in quite a lot of villains' schemes relying on them getting caught by the heroes at some point and then escaping, instead of the other way round. In this case, the villain is determined to actively recruit the hero, and from what we've seen of Lamont, it's perfectly possible that it might be successful. They meet a few times throughout the film, and it really works well. In a similar subversion, Margot is hypnotized by Khan and ordered to kill the Shadow, hoping that Lamont will have to kill her to nudge him towards that darker side. But Lamont simply breaks the hypnotic trance, and as a result, Margot is able to deduce that Lamont Cranston is the Shadow. It gives her a little more agency than the typical damsel in distress role. In fact, at no point in this film is she required to be rescued by the hero. We also discover that Khan was trained by the Tulka, but was not convinced to use his powers for good, and stabbed the Tulka with the sentient Purba dagger that Lamont failed to master control of, indicating that Khan has better control over his powers than Lamont. As we plough towards the finale, Lamont has an encounter with Farley Claymore, the only man who has willingly chosen to work with Khan, and who is converting Margot's father's energy device into a weapon. He traps the Shadow, and so he has to be rescued by Margot. Another hint towards her character's agency, and the Shadow works out that the empty lot that they've gone near at several points in the film is actually Khan's hidden lair, which he's managed to hide from the entire city, once again showing his abilities exceed that of Lamont's. Unfortunately, this is the point where things began to fall apart for the film. Khan's big scheme has nothing to do with his mastery of hypnotism and telepathy. He just plans to blow up an atomic bomb as a demonstration of power, then demand to be put in charge of the world, or something similar. It's very thin. When we've seen how powerful he is, I don't know why his scheme isn't to either kidnap or simply threaten world leaders with assassination from anyone he chooses to hypnotize, as he is able to do this from some distance. It would have made much more sense of the ending, where the Shadow stabs Khan in the head, causing doctors to remove part of his brain to save his life, the part that gives him his psychic abilities. Instead, they have a very much truncated fight scene, which I understand is due to some problems they encountered during the filming of the film, while Margot and her father disarm the bomb, in typical ticking clock fashion. It's a real shame, as despite my earlier suggestions, nothing else I've mentioned are particularly of detriment to the film, but the ending really does let it down. For me, this is not enough to make me dislike the film, but it does feel a bit disappointing. It's like having a lovely meal at a restaurant only to discover that dessert is a single cracker. It's not quite enough. Well, that's my review of the film. Go check it out. Thank you. Goodbye.
The Shadow knows.